So, here we are, 8 years later.
We're here 8 years later, man. And I was trying to just post here for my 208 fans on Instagram to, let people know what's up.
Yeah, what's up?
Dude, a lot's up, man. A lot has hit the fan over the last, 8 years.
Is this a podcast where we can swear?
You can say whatever you want. I can't. So.
What's up, guys? Welcome to the Christian Skeptic. I am so excited to actually be saying those words because this has been a long time in the making. My name's Adam. I'm here with my co-host Aaron. We have been talking about this idea for years. I think we recorded the first couple episodes back in 2017-ish or something, and a lot of life has happened since then, and we're finally doing it. We're finally doing it now. And I mean, so much has changed. I can't even begin to describe how much has changed even just in the last year.
My gosh, everything has changed. In many ways, it feels like everything has changed. Like the bedrock of life, I guess you would say, has remained the same. But so much of how I thought we were to live, why I thought that way, has completely evolved. So yeah, that's going to be, I'm sure, going to give us plenty of fodder for discussion.
Do you feel like that change has mostly occurred in the last couple of years, or just the whole last 7 or 8 years since we recorded this before?
Supposedly Spurgeon, all these quotes from history where supposedly somebody said something. We don't know who actually said it a lot of times, but supposedly Spurgeon said, "No man knows how to preach until he suffers," type thing. I feel like your theology is barely shaped until you go through some form of suffering, some form of tragedy, upheaval. A girl in our home group last night, who's a great friend of ours, said that she has learned how to be a better Christian through tragedy, immense tragedy. And I just feel like, I don't know, I feel like maybe I'm a crappier Christian. I probably am a crappier Christian in some respects, at least behaviorally, because of suffering and tragedy and betrayal and all these things, that kind of lambast all of us. But it definitely, I think, shapes our view of the world and our theology, our philosophy for living, our purpose. So I would say, yes, definitely in the last 18 to 24 months, there's been quite a renaissance of belief.
In you?
Yeah, in me. Yeah. But I would say it does begin probably a decade ago or close to it.
So the original premise for this show was we were going to have these conversations, and the subtitle we talked about was like a conversation between a pastor and a skeptic, which sounds really lame now, but at the time it seemed kind of cool. And I was supposed to be the skeptic, and I was, but not that's part of why it didn't really go anywhere, because I felt like I was playing this dual role. Like I was skeptical, but I didn't have enough courage just to be like, you know what, I don't believe any of this crap. I still was hanging on to it to some degree. So it was this weird dichotomy.
Do you feel like you were holding on to it, though, just because you had been so trained and inundated and marinated to hold on to it? Or was it some convictional root down deep that was there?
Well, at the time, it would have been way too scary to think about what is life if I leave all this behind, because this was my whole life. Yeah. If you leave it all behind, what does anything even mean? And it would have felt that would have been way too scary to face. But obviously looking back, I feel like God's sovereignty was at work. And even since then, I feel like I've gone through several sort of crises of faith, if you will. And what is very odd is that now, at this point in my life, I feel like I don't know about my faith, but my belief that all of this is true, capital T truth, God is real, the Bible is true, however you want to define that, is stronger than ever, though my life, at least from maybe an external perspective, probably looks, as you were hinting at, worse than ever.
Not as pious.
Yeah, exactly.
Like you said, I mean, we grew up together, and we grew up in the church, a pretty extreme right-wing version of the church, generally speaking. I mean, about as strict as you can go without becoming Amish. I mean, honestly, to me anyway.
I think we were already in that camp a little bit.
We were, minus the buggies. For those who don't know, the show on Amazon, I think it's on Amazon Prime, The Happy Shiny People. Ab and I literally were in that cult growing up. Like we were there, and that's where we were raised. So it kind of has all the earmarks of a cultish movement. And so that was the church. At least we were like raised kind of in, broadly speaking, evangelicalism. But as we progressed into college and into the next several years of life, things went different directions in some ways for us. And so in 2017, we converged. That was just a few months after my daughter's open heart surgery, Evie's open heart surgery. She's now 7. And you were kind of going through your own stuff, like church trauma and hurt and betrayal, which anybody who's spent really any amount of time in church has experienced, and now we both experienced much more of. And so we decided back then, I think it was actually January 18, but we decided to record just some conversations like this. But at the time, I was in a significantly dark place of questioning the goodness of God, the kindness of God, I guess, specifically. And, does healing take place, and what the heck is prayer for? And you were questioning maybe bigger, in some ways, bigger issues than that, maybe not as practical, more philosophical of, the legitimacy of scripture and maybe the resurrection and all that kind of stuff. And so we recorded those conversations between a pastor and a skeptic. And now we find ourselves having, I would say, progressed, but in some ways it feels like we have digressed down a rabbit hole. But I think the rabbit hole is an attempt to discover or to stumble upon truth, which brings us to like Greytown, C.S. Lewis. Greytown is from The Great Divorce. And it's kind of the world, it's indicative of hell or the world in which we live, this kind of empty, shallow, broken place of loneliness and despair and discouragement and depression, and where in the book it's raining all the time, even inside, you're getting wet inside, all the houses are miles and miles apart. Anyway, and so it's just kind of indicative of what hell or even purgatory, according to like a Roman Catholic view, but for me anyway, and I think for you, like what this world is kind of like we're living in Greytown a lot of times. Like it's a very collapsed, fractured place in which we live. And so, the truth gets distorted very easily, even in church circles. And what Christians are to be and to believe gets distorted. So that's what kind of brings us to why we're doing this and sets up kind of some of the discussions I think we're going to have.
Yeah. I love The Great Divorce, one of my favorite books, and the way he talks about Greytown and just describes things. It kind of feels like life between heaven and hell. He describes it as it can be a section of hell or it can be the prelude to heaven, depending on who you are.
Don't you feel like earth is a lot, I don't know, maybe you don't. I feel like earth is a lot closer to hell than it is to heaven. I feel like because this world is like passing away, according to 1 John, and it's disintegrating all around us. And the natural proclivity here is, like Paul says in Romans 8, like creation itself is groaning in the pains of childbirth. And so I feel like it is to draw a line to almost compare this world with what hell will be. Tim Keller, I don't want to misquote him, but Tim Keller, similar to C.S. Lewis, says that hell is just the final descent. Like we're all kind of naturally descending. Yeah. We're all naturally, at least this is how I'd see it, whether Tim Keller said it or not. He knows a lot more than I do now because he's gone, but we're all kind of naturally descending toward chaos. And when someone dies apart from Christ, they get that final kind of slide off the sliding board, so to speak, into the abyss, into condemnation. And the only way that that's reversed is redemption and the renewal of all things and the return to Eden. So to me, like the idea of Greytown being representative of hell or of this world, there's not, I don't mean to like minimize how horrific hell is going to be, whatever that might look like. But I do think that that we get glimpses of it here. Like I was just at a care facility today, where a lady in her 60s, stage 4 cancer, has maybe 36 hours to live. And you get glimpses there in death of hell, And so, and death is something we're very associated with. People obviously pass away all the time. I've lost a couple people this year. So, anyway, that's where we find ourselves. And so we're trying to if I'm honest, probably through this podcast, we're trying to stumble upon truth, discuss truth, make light of the situation, maybe a little bit, this hellish situation we find ourselves in. I don't know.
To answer your question, I do think that, yes, the way you described Earth, just living life in general, is that way. Although I tend to be pretty cynical. I think you might even edge me out in your cynicism.
I'm a very optimistic individual. I'm not sure if
this is not going to be a happy podcast for anyone who's wanting a dose of joy in the morning.
So they got Sadie Robertson on the other side of us, so they can go that direction.
So I look at life that way. Yes, obviously we were raised with this view of heaven that was, in the clouds. It's something far away from here, and very amorphous. The pie in the sky. While we don't know a lot about heaven, Scripture talks about heaven as the new earth, the new Jerusalem. So I think heaven is going to look, personally, I think it's going to look a lot more like what we have now, but perfected.
You don't think it's going to look like Game of Thrones or like Narnia?
Dude, I don't know.
I actually tend to agree with you. Yeah, that's an interesting thought, that this life is a lot more like hell than it is heaven. But this world, when we see the beauty of it, when we go out to Sedona,
right,
and go across to British Isles, whatever it is, the Rocky Mountains, even out here on the Gulf, the sunset is more representative of heaven. So the brokenness, the pain, the suffering, the evil that exists in this world, and the collapse of society and the denigration of other people and all the stuff that we see even in the church that's happening is very hellish. And yet juxtaposed to that is all this beauty. And so, yeah, you're right, dude. You're right. We're between heaven and hell. Well, you're right.
I'm not right. Lewis is right. That's why I like his analogy of how he describes Greytown and this space in between as it can be either or, depending on the person. And so I feel like not so much at a crossroads, but going through these crises of faith, but finding that my belief is strong. I wouldn't say my faith is strong because I'm always praying for stronger faith, whether you want to call it faith, belief, whatever. That is not in doubt anymore. But I do feel that sort of question that Schaefer asks, how do we then live? What does this mean? What do we do now? Things are what they are. We've been through suffering, been through difficult things. And it does sometimes leave you kind of what's really important? All the things that we grew up thinking were so important, all the things we had to perform, we had to do, turned out not to be that important. And so it does leave you with well, what are the important things?
Just asking, I don't need to be crucified first episode, but do you think potentially this whole concept of radicalized grace, which we'll get into, might free us to just do the best we can with the information we have? And what I mean by that is there's all these amazing Christians that are dead, bunch of old dead guys that we read after, the Bunyans and the Spurgeons and the Wesleys and the Lewis and all these guys. And there's a bunch of guys who are still alive. Sproul obviously just passed recently, but you've got Piper and you've got Wilson and you've got, I don't know, just whoever you want to throw out there, if you're a Christian. And they almost all disagree. In nuance, and some of them significantly. Not just on, they all agree, obviously, if they're within the stream of Orthodox vertical Christianity, they believe in the resurrection of Jesus and they believe salvation is by grace through faith. And they believe in that kind of age-old Reformation doctrine of, supremacy of Scripture and the glory of God, all that kind of stuff, which is true and it's good. So very helpful. But when it comes to this, how then should we live? It gets extremely convoluted. And it seems and at least I'm awake enough to admit it. I'm woke enough to admit it. It seems to me like people are just making crap up sometimes based on their own bias. And I'm doing the same thing. That's what I mean. I'm awake enough to admit it. What do I want Christianity to look like? What do I want this Christian life to look like? I'm just, okay, you know what? I kind of want it to be more free. after everything I've gone through and my upbringing, that happy, shiny people upbringing, and then the reform world, which is not much fun over the last 20 years, the Acts 29 Gospel Coalition world.
It's kind of just a different facet of the happy, shiny people in a way.
Yeah, in a way, yes. I mean, it's, they both would say salvation by grace, grace alone. But there's a whole lot of works in there that feel very meritorious. They feel very like this is how you're earning not just a smile on God's face, if even that's biblical, but earning his favor, his love, like his affection, his devotion toward you. And they'd be like, no, and just let yourself screw up, even minimally. And all of a sudden it's like, well, they won't say it, but God doesn't really love you anymore. He doesn't affirm you anymore. He doesn't favor you anymore. And we're going to show you just how much he doesn't favor you.
Because we're going to cast you out.
You brought up something today when we were setting up for this that I think was very fascinating. You were talking about your journal from a year ago.
Yeah, I'm sure we'll get into things that have occurrences that have occurred in the last 18 months at some point. But we've both had similar experiences over the years. And I have this 5-year journal where each page, there's a block for each year. So you get to the end of it and you can look over each day for 5 years. And so this is my second year through it.
You should just give up, man. It's not going to get any better from here.
I know. It is getting,
it's getting
I
worse.
actually color code it. Like if I'm writing in red ink, it's because it was a really bad day. And if you flip through, it's been getting a lot more red. But anyway, I got to the entry yesterday and I read the previous year's entry about some stuff that was happening a year ago. And it reminded me of a decade ago. I don't remember. We were part of a church plant and Jessica and I were having some really difficult times. And I was the worship director and the lead planter. Found out about these difficult times we were having. And he was like, okay, you got to step down. You need to focus on your family. You can't be involved. You need to focus on your family. It's all couched in this. You need to focus on your family and fix your issues. And I felt devastated because my only anchor to what I felt like was reality and hope was that church plant and what I was doing in that church plant. And I had the thought then, like, what is the sense when someone is at their lowest, casting them out and cutting off those lifelines? And something similar happened to you. When people are in their lowest point, why is that when we cut them off?
Obviously, I would think anybody listening who knows me at all, but you know what? That is such a terrible assumption because some people who know me hate me. So, but hopefully those who know me well, or at least care about me, would know that when I say I want to live free, like I say all the time, I preach all the time, that, true freedom in Christ is not the ability to do whatever you want. It's the ability to do what you ought to do. But what is that? Like, what is that? And I think that there's a lot of freedom in that. I think there's a lot of freedom in representing the King well in varying ways apart from what he explicitly condemns, which would be biblically transgression, iniquity, sin, whatever you want to call it.
Yeah.
And so I think there's a ton of freedom in that, and what we've done is we've just adopted societal standards. But what happens in the church a lot of times, and it's not depending on the Reformed church or the Independent Baptist church that we grew up in or anything like that. It feels like churches everywhere. It feels like Christianity everywhere, is that whether we transgress societal standards and norms, or we actually screw up biblically, like we said, that in those moments, because we have so shackled ourselves, so to speak, with all the rules of religiosity, performance, and achievement, we can't possibly condescend like Jesus did and stoop down and help those people. Instead, we have to alienate those people and we have to cast those people out. And a lot of times, sadly, we do it. I truly believe, if we're awake enough to realize this, we do it in our own self-righteousness. We all hate self-righteousness in other people. We do it ourselves, meaning that like we'll take a stand and I'll be like, well, Adam's such a sinner, like, I just can't hang out with him anymore. He's just so bad. And look at me, like now I've taken a positional stance because I'm so righteous. I can't compromise myself to possibly, like Jesus did, eat with sinners. But unlike Jesus, you're a freaking sinner too. That's eating with sinners. He was the only perfect one who was eating with sinners. That's all we have to eat with. Like, and that's all the others have to eat with. Like, we're all sinners. We're all broken here. And I think, I don't know. I think I depress my home group sometimes, but like when I was talking last night and I'm like, I just have embraced the idea that I sin every day, maybe not behaviorally, but on the inside. Like that when I do well, I'm so proud of myself. And when I don't do well, I beat myself up, which is also just a reverse form of pride. Like, once again, check out Sadie Robertson or Stephen Furtick if you want to feel good. But my view of the human condition is so deplorable and collapsed that's juxtaposed that is this radical beauty of divine grace. That everywhere we look here in Greytown, we see collapse and we see ruin everywhere. And we contribute to that no matter how self-righteous and holy we think we are. And the only pure constants that is good is the mercy of God. Like that's it.
Yeah.
And so how are we to live? With a constant awareness, or as constant as it can be in a fractured soul, even a redeemed but fractured soul, a constant awareness of the grace of God, that I'm getting from him what I don't deserve. Like that I'm getting good reports. I'm getting healing of the soul. I'm getting cleansing. I'm receiving compassion again and again and again. And I think that was the awakening for Luther. You read Bondage to the Will, like that was the awakening for Luther is, oh my gosh, I've been trying to do this thing for so long and I've almost given up trying and I'm just resting now.
Yeah. You said something about doing the best you can, which reminded me of back at that same church plant. Someone was asking me like, what do you think? And this was a time when I'd gotten into like Steve Brown and Tullian, and this was 2012.
All the
probably.
antinomians.
Yeah. Before all their falls. But anyway, the question was like, what is this life about? Like, what do we do? I mean, it was the same answer. It was like, honestly, not to make light of it, but it feels like do the best you can and try to enjoy the ride, And I think all the people you named, all the Pipers, and as much as I love those guys and have had a huge influence on me, I think would hate that answer.
Well, dude, we hate their answers though, man.
Yeah. It's like, it takes all the focus off of the weird little lists of do's and don'ts that supposedly determine how holy you are or whether you're a Christian or not. And even Lewis talked about how Greytown was filled with everyone just consumed with the petty idiosyncrasies that dominated their lives. That was all they could comprehend. That was it. And we do our own version of that where it's like how a person might speak or dress or drink or watch or all these things that they do or don't, these external things.
Yeah.
That's where all the focus is. We put so much importance in those things. So I think even over the last couple of years, it seems like there's been a theological shift for you. I think there has been for me too. A lot of people go through some serious suffering, whatever it is, and many of them just fall away. They abandon all this and move on to something new because something happened that really, really sucked and really, really hurt. And it was like, what's the point? I just don't want to do this anymore. And that's not what has happened in our situation. But again, as Lewis mentions in The Great Divorce, we can't take all our luggage on this journey. It might require to leave behind some eyes and some right hands. So there's things that have been left behind in the last year. I'm sure for you, definitely for me over the last several years.
I think I came to the point last year of going, I think about 70% of Christianity is made up at this point in modern Christianity.
Yeah.
I'm not talking maybe about like what's preached on Sunday morning, even though that's pretty bogus too a lot of times. But I'm talking about how we actually just live our lives as Christians.
Yeah.
I want to say like 3/4 of it maybe. It's just kind of, at least what I think that my natural bias is kind of made up. And granted, we don't have time on this first episode to like talk through all of that. And maybe that's a good discussion for another episode of what is made up. What is, and we've talked a lot about different standards that we have. I talked about the pressure society and especially church culture puts on us to like live a certain way. And even in our home group once again last night, which I'm sure we'll reference a lot because we go deep in our home group. And you talked about like church is kind of like kicking people out their lowest.
Yeah.
Our home group is kind of, and I know that probably people listening or watching, this has been the case for them as well, where they have found by God's grace, like community that has stuck with them and had good conversation. But in our home group last night, somebody's like, well, this is what it means to be a good Christian. And then they're like, I think. Maybe. Yeah. And they're kind of looking around the room because everything's up for discussion at this point. Like, what does it mean to be a good Christian? Like, is there even such a thing practically speaking? Like Luther called it simul justus et peccator, which means in Latin, simultaneously justified and sinful. But he's talking about two different realities. He's saying that we're justified positionally and we're sinful practically. So practically speaking, is there such thing as a good Christian? Probably another good episode to unpack that. Maybe we'll invite a good Christian on that episode.
Yeah. I don't know if I know any.
Oh, yeah, I know any.
That's the thing, because the Bible is not specific. Even Jesus narrowed it down to all the law and the prophets. Everything can be summed up in love God, all your heart, mind, soul, strength, and love your neighbor as yourself. And that leaves, could it be more vague? Honestly, there's so much room for interpretation there, which makes it odd to think about why then the church has proceeded for the last several thousand years to decide to make of utmost importance and divide over all the specific things that are not even mentioned in that statement.
Yeah, I mean, actually, I'm really glad you brought that up, because what if Jesus was meaning to leave it vague on purpose, which it seems like he was, or else he would have qualified it. So love the Lord your God with all your heart and soul, and love your neighbor as yourself. In this is all along the prophets. Well, now that doesn't mean there should not be discussion around what does it mean to love God and love your neighbor. Okay.
Right.
Because every church in America now has the slogan, love God, love people. And like, that's their mission statement. Yeah. But what the heck does that actually mean to love God and to love people? Because we have various degrees and views of what that means in our society and in our culture and in churches today. And it certainly doesn't mean to do nothing, but it also doesn't mean to be like a jerk to people. So,
and I think it has a lot to do with who this God is that you're loving. And you've talked about that a lot in sermons over the last couple of years. We've talked about that a lot in home group books we've read and stuff, that a big part of the change that has happened between when we were 24 and now 44 is realizing that this God that we were worshiping, following, trying to appease, didn't really exist. Like, that God didn't exist.
That's probably part of this renaissance of grace that I've been experiencing. The idea of grace is such, to me, is so compelling, so powerful, and so beautiful that most of us, including me and you right now, here we are at 44, don't have a freaking clue about 90% of who God is. Yeah. You know, like, I mean, like, if he's really inexhaustible and eternal and infinite, and we don't even know how to, like, adequately define those words. Like, how do you define eternal and infinite and making decisions outside of time and all that is God? And yet we're worshiping once again, we're doing the best we can. That doesn't mean we like check our brain at the door and just like, oh, well, we'll never know. Like, but we're collecting like little bits of information as time goes by, and we know a lot more now than we did at 20. But let's say that I know we didn't, but let's just say for the sake of argument, we had 1% of God figured out at 20, and now we have 3% of God figured out. We have an incomplete view of God, and we're worshiping the best that we can according to his revelation and how we understand that. And I think the fact that Jesus says, love God and keep his commandments, that Jesus is not overcomplicating the issue. And I think that we are a lot of times.
Yeah, I think one of the big changes that's happened for me is like I spent so long trying to make everything make logical sense.
Yeah, good luck.
And that was where we ended up 7 years ago with this show. What that had done was worked me into a position where this can't be real because I can't make sense of it. You know, I can't make sense of these things. And so part of my letting go over the last few years has been to just be like, it's okay that I cannot reconcile all of who God is, because how would that be possible anyway? And even if I could, what kind of God would that be?
Dude, you know, I think that's a perfect, I don't know, maybe you're like, no, shut up, and like, we're just gonna keep recording. I feel like that would be like a perfect topic for episode 2 of the illogical inconsistencies of Christianity, and yet to tease it out, how we do that with everything in life. That the most important things in life don't make any sense logically. And if you want to know what those are, just come back for episode 2, I guess. Is that it for episode 1?
That's it. That's it. We did it. We're 8 years later.
8 years later, and this will probably be one and done.
I know.
Goodbye, folks.
All right.